Mm, mm. Hey, stolen cousins. Y'all know what time it is? Get your blunt, get a blanket, get cozy because we about to watch something creepy. Mm, 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 mm. Three True Phone Call Horror Stories Animated. SSG Animations. If you haven't already, go subscribe to their channel because we be on there heavy. We be supporting, liking everything that we watch, giving credit where credit's due. And other than that, like, comment, and subscribe. You can like now. You can subscribe now if you're not subscribed already. And you can comment now because you can comment what horror movie you've seen or you've seen that you would feel like would be a good movie for me to watch with y'all. I've probably seen it. I'm gonna just put it out there now. I love horror movies. That's why we're doing what we do, you know? But I definitely have to get back into watching my horror movies. So, comment a scary movie that you would like to watch with your fellow stolen family and your stolen cousins. And let's get into it. I wonder what they've been about to do. Phone calls? Definitely about to be like some ghost-based stuff.
Back when I was 19, I used to work at this cookie stand in the big mall not too far from my house. We had this cheap business cell that we'd used to take pickup orders on, so when it started ringing, I rushed to pick it up so I could take the order. I hear this guy's voice on the other end, and right away, I started thinking it's a prank call or something. This might sound weird, but you know when you can practically hear a person smiling on the other end, or rather, trying to hold back laughter or something. His voice sounded exactly like that. He says, do you make cookies to order? I told him, sure.
Get the fuck off my phone.
And that we make chocolate chip, double
That's what
chocolate,
you should have
macadamia nut, raspberry, white chocolate, all those. And then he starts asking a bunch more questions, sounding weirdly anxious as he does so. Asking what time we're open until, where in the mall we are, all this other stuff. And I'm just staying polite and answering all his questions. When I'm done answering his questions, he asked me what types of cookies we make again. And I really started getting the feeling that something was weird and off with this call. I'd literally only just told the guy what kinds of cookies we made, and it's not like it was a huge list or whatever. But still, I stay professional and repeat myself. Then he just says, okay, thanks, and ends the call. I'm thinking to myself, well, that was weird. But I just carry on with my shift as normal, thinking the guy just might turn up and buy some or whatever later. About an hour later, the phone goes again, and when I answer, I can blatantly recognize the exact same voice on the other end of the phone, asking me the exact same questions as before in the exact same tone. Do you, make cookies to order? Again, I keep it professional. It was my first real job, and I really didn't want to get fired. But I was definitely starting to feel like I was the victim of some dumb prank call, like maybe it was being recorded or something. So although it was definitely a little passive-aggressive, I opted for something such as, oh, hey, it's you again. We spoke earlier, right? Well, if you remember, we make chocolate chip, double chocolate, macadamia nut, or raspberry, and white chocolate. You want me to put you down for an order? Just let me know what time you can swing by to pick them up. There's a slight pause, and I actually think he's going to place an order. But all he says is, your hair looks really pretty today.
Oh no.
For a second, I thought, knew it. This is some sort of weird prank. But then I paused and thought to myself, can he actually see me? I was so taken aback that I remember replying, excuse me? And although I expected to just hear a bunch of guys laughing, there was just silence before he just hung up. And I suddenly found myself really on edge, going back and forth between thinking it was a prank and thinking, oh God, can he actually see me? I was so distracted by it that my next customer actually asked me if I was okay, and as much as I assured him that I was, I was definitely still feeling a little on edge. By saying that, it didn't take me long to assure myself that it was such a generic comment that he probably wasn't watching me, and that it was all just some creepy prank call, probably from a bunch of bored middle schoolers or something. But I also had this deep suspicion that whoever it was would call back eventually, and as it turned out, that suspicion was correct. Only maybe a half an hour after the second call, the phone in the cookie stall goes off again, and this time, I definitely recognized the last few digits of the guy's number.
Click.
Part of me just didn't want to answer the call, but another part of me wanted to let the guy know that he definitely couldn't intimidate me with just a few prank calls. So, I picked up the phone and gave him a curt, "Yes?" He then says it again. "Your hair looks really pretty today." So I hit him with a, "Oh yeah? Well, what style is it in?" So then imagine my horror when he not only describes the exact style it was in, but also brings up the pink highlights I had dyed into it like a week earlier. I didn't know what else to say other than, "You call here again and I'm reporting your number to the cops," before hanging up. As soon as I did, I started leaning out of the stall and looking around, trying to spot someone hanging around and watching me from a distance, but there was no one there. That really freaked me out, thinking the person had walked past me at some point during my shift, that I'd probably looked at them and just had no idea that they had such creepy intentions for me. Just to be sure, I ended up saving the number in the phone under creep, so there'd be no doubt about who was calling in the future. If the creep number came up, I'd just end the call without answering, then report the whole thing to my boss and the cell phone company so we could get the number blocked. They tried calling a few more times about an hour later, but I just did as I'd planned and ended the calls almost as soon as they came up. After that, they stopped trying, and by the time it was the last hour of my shift, and almost time to close up the stall, I started to feel a little calmer again. Then, right as I was about to close up shop, the phone rang again, this time from a different number than the creep's, so I immediately picked it up. As soon as I say hello, I realized that I'd made a huge mistake. It was the creep, and all he'd done was switch numbers somehow when he realized that I wasn't going to pick up. I also realized that I'd made a huge mistake in telling him when we closed, because the first thing he says to me is, "You're close to closing time, right? Then I'm guessing you're walking out to the parking lot to your car?" That had my heart racing, because yes, that's exactly what I was going to do. And either it was just a really good guess, or he'd been watching me way longer than I thought he'd had. For a second, I just didn't know what to say in return. I was so freaked out that I was actually stunned into silence. But although the words didn't come immediately, I just knew that I had to be aggressive, to try and show that I wouldn't go down without a fight. It took every ounce of bravery I had in me, and it may have been an overreaction initially, but I told him if I see anyone following me to my car, I'd claw their eyes out. I thought that might be enough, but the guy just laughed, then started saying stuff so evil and obscene that I honestly don't want to repeat it. Whoever was calling me that day had something wrong with them to dream up things like that. I know I should have just hung up the call straight away, but I think I was just so stunned for a second that I kept on listening. Something about their tone changed too. They sounded less like a dumb teenager and more like an intelligent, older man who was so full of this sick, twisted aggression. I was so scared that it actually took me a minute to get myself together enough to hang up. And as soon as I did, I called my dad and told him everything. How I didn't feel comfortable closing the stall on my own, and would he be okay driving down to walk me to my car. Of course, he came as quickly as he could, and he called the cops as I was closing up to tell them the number the guy called from. I was fighting back tears the whole time, and when I finally got to my car, I just burst into tears. My dad comforting me as I told him some of the things the guy had said to me over the phone. Just repeating them had him going pale and shaking with anger. I've honestly never seen him like that before.
So mad.
And every single evening after that, he'd show up an hour after I finished work, watching as I closed the stall down and then walking me to my car. For some reason, the cops were unable to trace the exact caller and they couldn't actually track the guy down, but they told us that they'd pinged the numbers off of 2 different cell towers in our county and he was definitely a local guy calling from somewhere relatively close. And other than that, there was nothing they could do but tell us to contact them if it ever happened again, as well as practicing caution when it came to my daily routine. That just wasn't good enough for me or Dad, as it amounted to hoping that nothing would happen to me, and as Dad put it, hope is not a plan.
It's not.
It sucked having to leave that job, as it was pretty much unsupervised and I got to take home any cookies that weren't sold at the end of the day. But it was either quit or risk the situation with my stalker escalating to the point where he'd actually show up and do something.
Yeah, your dad was
Like I said, I don't really want to repeat the things that he'd said he'd do to me, but I can promise you, they really didn't sound like empty, abstract threats. They sounded like things that he'd put some serious thought and planning into, which is exactly why I found them so upsetting. We later found out that another girl, who worked at the same mall I used to, ended up getting similar phone calls that ended up in similar threats, so it wasn't just me that had to suffer through that kind of abuse. In fact, it's actually kind of shocking how many other girls experience that kind of abuse in their lives at some point.
It's not.
And although most of the creeps don't actually
Some men
follow
are
up with
so
it,
weak.
I can tell you from experience that it can be an extremely stressful and frightening ordeal, especially when you're young.
I was on duty working yet another night in one of the most terrorizing jobs. Being a dispatcher taught me a lot of things. One of them is never to voice out that a night is a quiet night. Because the night I did that, I ended up handling one of the most stressful calls of my career. In boredom, I was spinning around in my chair after not receiving a single call in about 3 or 4 hours. The town I lived in is relatively quiet. We usually only receive calls from the elderly who tripped over their chairs and cannot get up, or prank calls from bored kids and angsty teenagers. But this night was especially quiet.
Kid, you get arrested
It's
for
a
that?
quiet night tonight. Hasn't been like this in a while, I said to my colleague who fidgeted around with pens and stickers behind me. Now, why would you say that, knowing the curse that's cast on that sentence? He said half jokingly, half serious, not breaking his focus from his toying around. It's just a myth.
I say that
Never
to
happened
everybody.
me. I said, tilting my head, ready to doze off. As if on cue, a 911 call came through. I picked up the
Oh,
phone
on
and
cue.
said the usual, 911, what is your emergency? But only got a rough 10 seconds of silence, then the increasing sound of fumbling and crunching on the other side. The call remained confusing for about 30 more seconds before I heard the scream of a young man booming through my headphones.
Oh,
I had to remove the headset from my ear to hear what he was saying. He's right there! Oh my god! Run! 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 I was instantly shocked to realize the gravity of
You
the
have to
situation
find the
and started
address. It's
asking
in
the
the
caller
top
to give
there.
me more information as
oh
I
my
tried to
God!
locate the
I
call.
hate y'all.
Little did I know that young Harley and Julian were going through the worst night of their lives on the other end. Earlier that evening, Harley and his 5 friends agreed to sneak out of the house and go stay the night in the forest right outside of town.
Oh, why would y'all
It's
do that?
unusual for teenagers to sneak out of their parents' homes to do nothing. Still, these boys had heard rumors about it being haunted.
Storyblocks?
They got their equipment ready and everything was set in place. And they headed into the core of the forest a little past midnight. As they walked through the unfamiliar landscape of the terrifying forest, realizing that the moon wasn't as bright as they had expected, even with 6 flashlights illuminating many angles of their route, the forest was undeniably dark and spine-chilling.
Y'all trying to call the cops on a
They camped
demon?
in the first spot with some good signals coming through and started unpacking their backpacks. Makeshift paranormal equipment and snacks of all sorts were laid out on the floor, and they were ready to
You're
meet these
trying to-
infamous ghosts.
Like,
George flashed his face unironically and started telling his friends the tales about the forest that he had heard from his friends. It said that this forest was home to many creatures that terrorize people of all kinds of beliefs. Demons, skinwalkers, dogmen, and even some believe that the most
Y'all
powerful
did
of
this
witches
to
that
yourself.
managed to
Now you're
escape
trying
their
to call
death
the
trials
cops?
were hiding within the twists and turns of the forest, summoning and interacting with all sorts of ghosts and spirits. He paused to see that 3 of his friends were scooching towards one another to comfort the sensation of fear rising with each one of them.
Snuggle.
while the other two seemed either uninterested or in disbelief of everything he was saying. And I suppose one can clearly guess who. Some even say that if you listen really closely, you can hear the trees casting the witches' runes and spells for them upon everyone who dares to enter these damned woods.
And here we are.
He finished looking around with wide open eyes, glaring at these supposed trees. Come on, man. You don't actually believe any of this BS is true. It's kinda insane if you ask me. Clearly, those are stories parents tell their kids to keep them out of the woods, Harley said while looking at Julian. That gave him a nod of approval. They were the only ones on the same page. Everyone else seemed to be highly on edge. The atmosphere, the story, the unfamiliarity, and the mischief of what they were doing clearly got to their head. Not even 2 or 3 seconds after Harley denied the forest the belief in its supernatural power, a soft but swift slashing sound was heard tiptoeing around them. There was a consistent sound of slashing, like an axe being sharpened or a sword piercing loudly through the air. It took no longer 2 or 3 minutes of absolute silence before 4 of the 6 wordlessly agreed to start packing their things and leaving. You guys, we haven't even gotten to use our ghost hunting tools, argued Julian as the rest paid no attention to him. They were all ready to book it, yet Julian and Harley were adamant about staying the night. It'll be fun, they said. Think about how cool this is gonna make us. If we can get proof that something is happening, we're gonna be the most popular at school. Little did they know that their courage would cost them many, many sleepless nights to come. After about an hour of the two being alone in the woods, their tools had failed to record anything, and the slashing noise seemed to be getting closer. Not directly, but surely. The two were not going to fold on this opportunity. They were the oldest in the group, yet neither one of them could have guessed that it might have been something other than ghosts. Something very much real and something very much capable of taking both of them out.
Someone just in the woods, huh?
That's exactly what it was. A few dozens of meters down the line, there was a man walking through the woods with his scythe and chipping away at everything that stood in his way. Everything needed to be equal length or else he would go mad, as if he wasn't just that already. Even if what was required to be cut down was the upper part of a human being. And as soon as he laid eyes on the boys, he knew that the satisfaction he would get from chopping them down would outdo all of the work he has been putting into the woods. The slashing noise stopped and the boys were nervously visible as they waited until they heard the sound of approaching footsteps. They realized just how much shit they had gotten themselves into.
They better not have left.
A butt-naked crazy man ran after them with blood all over his body and the promise that their blood would soon do the same. They ran into the dark of the night and the forest which they were unfamiliar with and quickly heard his footsteps fade behind them as they outran him. Or so they thought. Harley tried to get a signal coming through on his phone and realized that they would soon have to go back into the same direction that they came from. That was the only track they knew out of there and the only way for them to get help or leave unscathed. They edged their way closer to that spot and found no trace of the slashing man. Harley swiftly and slowly got closer to the tent and phoned 911. As he quietly waited for the call to link over, he heard the soft and undeniable sound of feet crushing the leaves somewhere around him. He landed his eyes on the man that was barely 10 meters away from him and panic immediately took over. He accidentally dropped the phone on the floor only to see that the call had gone through and 911 was on the other end. He picked up the phone again and dropped it once more in panic as the man gave him all the time to suffer the anxiety that came with being preyed upon like an animal before he came rushing for him with the scythe in hand and a crazy smile promising nothing but agony that's accompanied by inevitable death. He heard the sound of his worried friend booming through the woods when he finally saw him. "He's right there! Oh my God! Run! Run! Run!" The boys left
Go there.
everything behind them as Harley tried to speak on the phone and run simultaneously, but to no avail because the line had already cut from the absence of a signal. They ran for what seemed like an hour, but was barely 15 minutes while the footsteps behind them got further and further behind, either from the heavy weight of that massive scythe or the lack of clothing and protection from the harsh soil and nature of the forest. The sound of police sirens reassured the boys as they ran closer and closer to the edge of the forest. They finally made it safely out of a life or death situation that they had only gotten themselves into because of their egotistical teenagehood. I think the boys learned many, many lessons that day. I sure hope not going into the middle of an unfamiliar forest in the middle of the night was one of them.
Same.
I, on the other hand, learned to never speak of the quiet night curse ever.
Good. Watch your mouth.
The man was actually never found, and the parents, as well as many, questioned the sincerity of their story. But I, for one, heard the terror in the boy's voice as he screamed for his friend to run, and I personally never doubted it for a second.
Oh, good job.
For as long as they've been around, scary stories and urban legends alike have used the telephone as a central theme. From H.P. Lovecraft's The Statement of Randolph Carter to the opening scene of the multi-part Scream franchise, creepy telephone calls have captured the imagination of worldwide audiences for almost 100 years now. Yet back in 2007, a series of mysterious and terrifying events in the U.S. state of Washington proved once and for all that real life can be far stranger than fiction. This is the story of the restricted caller. In the Tacoma suburb of Faircrest, 16-year-old Courtney Kirkendall began to experience something very strange indeed. Her friends began to complain that she was sending them some rather cryptic text messages and asked her what they meant. But there was one major problem. Courtney hadn't been texting them at all, and she had the empty sent folder to prove it. Before Courtney's parents had the chance to address the issue, her phone began to receive a series of phone calls from someone with a scratchy voice, who called from a number which simply read, restricted. The calls consisted of the man with the scratchy voice describing whatever Courtney was doing at that particular moment, letting her know in the creepiest way possible that he was somehow watching her from afar.
No.
Yet these calls weren't just restricted to young Courtney, as one of the Kirkendall's neighbors, Andrea McKay, also found herself a target of the mysterious calls. One day, she answered her phone while cutting limes in her kitchen, only to have the mysterious caller tell her that he preferred lemons. By the time that the Kirkendall family noticed that all of their cell phones were behaving strangely, they decided to contact their local police department. They complained that their phones were not only sending text messages on their own, but they were also turning themselves on unprompted, with the ringtone spontaneously changing. They also informed police of the bizarre phone calls that they were receiving, and after turning the devices over to the police, they were assured that any further calls would be traced in order to identify the mysterious caller. In the days that followed, when a call came into one of the family's phones, police began to quickly trace the origin of it. Yet when they finally identified the source of the calls, they came from a place they least suspected.
Where did it come from?
You see, according to the trace program, the calls were coming from Courtney's phone, even when it was switched off. This led police to recommend that the family switch cell phones altogether. But since they couldn't afford to, they simply kept their current phones and hoped the problem would subside on its own.
It's not.
But instead of petering out, the calls only grew more intense. Heather Kirkendall, the family matriarch, claimed that during one call, the scratchy voice caller said, "They say you're going to die. We hate you.
Who's in
We're
it?
going to murder you."
Oh.
The calls also started coming during the midnight hours, and even if the family members turned their phones off, whoever had control of their devices would simply switch them on before calling. In the end, they were forced to take the batteries out at night in order to get any real sleep. Arguably, the most terrifying call came to the neighboring McKay family, with the caller claiming that there was going to be a shooting at their children's school. The caller also seemed to know the exact school that they were attending, which made the threat all the more frightening for their terrified parents. The McKays were so scared and upset by the call that they called the threat into their children's school, but thankfully, no such shooting ever occurred. The next escalation in the calls came when one didn't feature the scratchy voice caller at all, but rather a recording of a private conversation between members of the Kirkendall family. One such call featured a recording of a conversation between one of the family members and a detective who was dealing with their case, as if to show that the caller was well aware of their attempts to apprehend him. It was like the caller knew the police were almost incapable of catching him, and the Fircrest PD had stated on multiple occasions that the investigation was floundering. It's entirely possible that the scratchy-voiced man had heard this admission somehow, in the same way he'd listened to and recorded the family's conversations. Despite the caller violating several federal laws, law enforcement was still warming up to the idea of cybercrime in 2007. Fircrest Police Chief John Cheeseman told the media, "We're almost dumbfounded. We've never seen anything like this." Their confusion was such that, at one point, the police actually suspected one of the family members as being the guilty party, with one detective stating that, "At this point, we aren't saying it's someone inside the family, but it's someone that is close enough to them to know this much about them. It seems like it's someone who is tied into the group, a family member, a friend or enemy." For a brief period, the story of the Kirkendalls' digital harassment drew the interest of both the regional and national media. But when the police failed to bring about a speedy resolution to the case, journalistic interest seemed to drop off entirely. To this day, the case remains entirely unresolved, and although incidents of phone hacking are relatively rare, they're surprisingly easy to pull off. Phone hacking, or phone breaking as it used to be called, has been going on since the telephone was first invented. Telecommunications enthusiasts began by hacking payphones and learning how to impersonate phone operators in order to make free calls, and if a person had access to the right technology, tapping a phone line was a frighteningly simple process. Even today, in the age of advanced digital security and two-step authentication, phone hacking is still a very real possibility, with hackers remaining only 1 or 2 steps behind even the most cutting-edge technology. And these days, it's clear we rely on our phones for almost everything. They serve as our wallets, our televisions, our record players, our cameras, and our photo albums. You need only remind yourself of the minor panic you last experienced when you thought you'd lost your phone. It's scary enough thinking that we've become addicted to them, but perhaps it's even scarier to realize that they're perhaps one of the most potent attack vectors in our lives. There are people out there with the power to turn something that makes our lives easier into something that can make our lives a living hell. With just the small piece of plastic we carry in our pockets, someone can steal from us, blackmail us, and terrorize us. So unless we, as a society, begin to exercise a kind of sharper digital discipline, the things we rely on most remain gateways by which pure torture can be unleashed.
You ain't lying at all. Phones have definitely taken over our whole everything. Me and my husband the other day, not the other day, but a few months ago, he was like, you wake up and the first thing you do is check your phone. It definitely is. Before you wake up and see your alarm clock, Technology is upgrading, and they're making sure to put it in every little bit of our lives. We gotta be careful with that. Thank you for watching with me. Let me know what was your favorite one. The last one was crazy. They getting hacked. What, people playing on the phone. Her daddy came through like, not my baby, not today. And number 2, going places you ain't supposed to go. So I'll see this one goes for me. It goes. Ooh, does it go 3 first or does it go 1? Probably 1. 1, 3, 2 is my order for this one. Let me know your order in the comments. Let me know which one you like and which one you dislike. Thank you for watching with me. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share with someone if you want to. Why not, right? We're cousins. That's what family do. I love you. Bye.